So it's a very great honour and privilege to have a chance to talk to Sir Aaron Klug. How would you like me to address you, if I have to address you? As Aaron, or?
Aaron. I'm known as Aaron in the lab.
Is that all right?
I was on first name terms ever since Max Perutz.
Okay.
When one of the younger people in the lab, the assistants, kept calling him Dr. Perutz, he said, well, if you're going like that, I shall have to call you Mrs. Hay instead of her first name.
Lovely. Well, I would start with where and when you were born.
Yes. I was born in Lithuania in 1926. My father's father was actually a cattle dealer, and he had a farm. It's very unusual for Jews to possess property, to possess land, because it was forbidden under the old Tsarist regime. But this was Lithuania, and so what he did was to buy up cattle from the small peasants and then take them to market. And my father was sent to the big town, to Kaunas, to be trained as a saddler. He was trained as a saddler, but then his father got him to help in the business. So my father was involved in cattle dealing and so on, but he realized there was not much of a future in Lithuania, and quite a number of Lithuanian Jews had moved to South Africa. It's a small Jewish community.
Sidney Brenner's family was another one.
He's from Ukraine, yes.
Oh, Ukraine.
Well, I'm not, that's what he says, but I think he's from part of those border areas, but I think he is, it's the same sort of culture, yes. And so my family moved, my father moved in 1929 because my mother's family had emigrated members of my family had emigrated to South Africa at the turn of the century, 1900. And they established, their family name was Gevissa.
How do you spell that?
G-E-V-I-S-S-E-R.
Yeah.
And they had established a business dealing in sort of primary material in Durban, South Africa. And so that's where we went. I remember nothing of it, of course, but I must have learnt English pretty early on. And I have an elder brother who's a few years older than me, 21 months older than me, and so we moved. And so my father was employed in the Gevissa. Michel Gevissa was the name of the company. And they dealt in primary products, because my father knew something about leather, being a saddler. So he was involved in buying hides and things of that sort. He was a sort of hide merchant working for Michel Gevissa. And then and so that's how he came. He went early, as was tradition. He went ahead of the family, and after he'd found a place to live and so on, the rest of the family came out. So he went first pretty soon after my birth. I had an elder brother, as I said, and so then the family followed, and we got to Durban around about 1929. I was 2.5 or something of that sort. I remember nothing of it, of course. And so he went on working for them, and we had no other family in Durban, although my father's brother immigrated to Johannesburg some years later. So I did have cousins, Klug cousins in Johannesburg. That figures later in the story. So I went to...
Tell me something about the character of your father, I mean, as a person. And
my father, well, he was very much concerned with making well, making a good living.
And if
like
you
to put this
tell it to me.
he was making a good living, and he was regarded. He had been regarded as clever, but he never had much of an education, you see. But he had a standard Jewish education, and after he retired, he would go to. He had a curiosity because he would always go to. In Hebrew, it's Gemara Shiurs. These are lessons. He would go to the synagogue. He was just an ordinary observant Jew, but he was interested in Talmud, and he never had the full education to go through Talmud. And so he would, but later on in life, when he had more time and semi-retired, he would go to these lessons once a week, where you studied various sections of the Talmud. And so I remember when I got married in England. So when we went to England, he wrote me a letter quoting. The idea was that you would quote some parable or something, or some extract, and he sent certain letters like that. But he was concerned mostly with getting on in the world and making sure that we were all right. So I went to primary school.
And your mother?
My mother died when I was about 6 years old, of those days of pneumonia. And my mother's younger sister had come with us. And I don't know what happened, but she had helped bring us up, you see, the two of us. And so some years later, after my mother died, my aunt, as she was, had been much courted. She was a good-looking woman, and she married my father. And I don't know what went on, but I'm told that the older cousin, one of the Gavissa cousin, the older one of the family, said it was her duty to marry my father and help bring us up the two boys. Now I don't know what happened, but they got married. I was about 7 or 8 years old. So and so she just continued. We used to call her aunt, which was until some years later. My brother and I realized she was actually our mother. It took some years, and she didn't object to it. So we began to call her Mum. And that was I found it difficult to call her Mum.
Was she a warm
Yes, she was. She was quite. Well, she'd always been around, you see, so she was a second mother anyway, and so on. So that was she was my Aunt Rose, was her name, and so she became Mum. Now, I went to a primary school. It was interesting in Durban. We lived in a house near the bush. Durban was a relatively small town, had a white population of 100,000, very English, settled almost entirely by English, so that the people I went to school with, their parents still called England home, you see, which was typical of the Natal English. The big settlement in Natal there'd been one in the 1870s, but there'd always been people coming to Natal. I don't know if you know how much I have in history, you know, but you know that the English conquered Natal from the Dutch, from the Boers, 1842 and things like that. So in 1870 there was an immigration into Durban. And so it was a very English town. In fact, when I came we went on our first holiday in England, and we went to, where was it, to Swanage or somewhere, and the beach huts, and in Durban, which is a beautiful subtropical climate, the beach huts on the beach where the people would sit were carved, and they had they had sides to stop the wind, but there was no wind. You see, they were copied exactly from England, and the post boxes were exactly in England, you see. And so England was, and I say England, we didn't call it Britain in those days. It was and I knew pretty well. I knew roughly what the map of London was. So when I came to, my wife says, when I came to England as a student, I knew exactly where I was. And that was a bit later, and it was very. And so at school, then I went to high school, Durban High School, and the philosophy of Durban High School, it was founded in 1875, and it was very simple. If you were bright at high school, you went into the Latin class, and it had been Latin and Greek, but Greek had been abandoned because we had to do Afrikaans as a second language. So if you were bright, you went into the science class. As if you went to the Latin class, you had no choice. And if you're not so bright, I don't know how they sorted them, because there was a little movement between classes. And on the whole, it was fixed when you came. You went into the science, and if you were in the third category, you had to make do with geography or things like that. So that was the curriculum. Well, I was very good at school. I always came first in the tri-weeklies. My brother always came second. We were in the same class. He's 2 years older than me, and it wasn't. None of us realized it was really we should never have been in the same class. But what happened is that he started out ahead of me, but they had the business of jumping. I was 2 years behind. It was putting you up, and it was quite easy to accommodate. But it was a great help because I was. He was pretty bright too, you see, and so. But he was older than me, so he was a sort of protector in a sense. So that was the Durban High School.
But you were very bright, so you got into the classics stream, did you?
Well, it was Latin.
Latin, yeah.
Yes, into Latin stream. But we did do science. We did do one subject, science. The science class did full physics and full chemistry. That was it. And I was pretty good at Latin. And we used to, with some of us who were 5 or 6 of us who sailed through the Latin, he invented some extra lessons for us, so we had to try to write. We write Latin composition. We had to read Cicero's speeches and try to write little essays on that style. It was quite rigorous. It was before they came down, so I enjoyed that.
You were obviously a good linguist because you had Afrikaans,
yes,
Latin, English, and Hebrew.
My brother and I went to Hebrew classes. In Afrikaans, I was pretty fluent in Afrikaans. In fact, I got a distinction in what's called the Hoër Taalbond. Taal is language in Dutch, bond. And the Hoër is the higher language, so you could get a qualification in Afrikaans. I read quite a lot of Afrikaans literature. Hebrew, I really wasn't all that. I knew I could read biblical Hebrew. I wasn't very good at modern Hebrew. And but when I mentioned coins, later when I began collecting coins, Greek and Roman coins, I could read the Greek, of course, from the Greek alphabet and so on. I had a dictionary. The Hebrew coins, which were during the Seleucids and the Maccabees at the time of independence, although their Hebrew script had changed, they were written in the ancient script, which is Phoenician. So I learned that and so on. So I enjoyed languages. Later on, when I forgot my Latin, but then when one of my sons started doing Latin at school here in England, I decided I'd better brush up my Latin. I thought I would just see it. So I got hold of interlingua text. Have you ever seen these? Well, you get the Bible that way. You can get concordances. So what happens is that you have a text. You can get a Greek text or a Hebrew text, and underneath is the translation, word for word. Now, what happened? So I decided I'm going to read Caesar's Civil War again, which I knew pretty well at school. This was quite a while older. And as I began reading it, it looked all wrong. And I realized what had happened. This was an American. This was done from the John Dewey, he was the famous educationist. I got it from a book store at Columbia University, where I've been visiting. And they had changed the Latin word order so that the English could be continuous. So in disgust I threw it away. So I never so
You're obviously a very studious person to do so well in all these things, but did you have any hobbies or...
Oh yes, sport. Well, the main thing, the thing that mattered most at Urban High School was sport. So we had sport in the afternoons 4 times a week. We had a school team, and there was practice, and there was a
cricket, of course.
Cricket, yes, cricket. Well, right. Well, the same. We had rugby.
Rugby.
We had practice, and so we always had, and we had cadets on the 5th day, old-fashioned cadets. So that was kept you busy.
Were you good at any of these sports?
No, not very. No, I discovered. My brother was a good cricketer, and he was a left-hander, very good bat. So but I wasn't, because I discovered later why. It turned out that particularly in tennis, I could never hit a backhand. And later, when I came to have my South African Army test, when you turn 17, ready for 18, you had to have a South African Army. The war was on. I'll explain that later. And I discovered they thought I was blind in my right eye. But what happens? I discovered they have an optic atrophy, so I only have central vision, so I can't see anything. And this explained why. When I was on my bike, I couldn't see people passing on the right side. I never noticed it wasn't a handicap until, but they thought I was blind, and so so what happened? I had an atrophy of all the peripheral of the optics. So that was so I wasn't. But I wasn't a natural sportsman anyway, my brother was. So,
and what about music and things like that?
Music. Well, my brother was very keen on music, so we listened to records. And I was introduced gradually. We didn't have any instruments at home, because we had the radio, we listened a lot to the radio. And there were selections, there were classic sections and so on. So I began, when I was still at school in the last few years, to listen to serious music on either records or on the radio. And by serious music, I mean Beethoven's violin concerto, the piano concerto, and things like that. But I'm not musical, though, and I couldn't sing. In primary school, I couldn't sing in tune. I haven't got. So that was.
But do you listen to music much now, or?
I do a bit. My wife does. My wife's very musical. She was a good pianist, and so I listen to that. But we don't go much to concerts and so on. We used to go when we lived in London. We would sometimes go to the Albert Hall and places like that. I enjoy it. I enjoy the obvious classics, so to speak. And my wife she was very experimental. She ran, this is my wife, they will come to that later, she ran the Cambridge University dance group. It was modern dance. And so I remember she was trying out Stockhausen and people like that. And electronic music. But I didn't care for that. I just have the standard classics, you see. So I wouldn't say I'm not musical.
Was there often a person's academic life is deeply influenced by one or two teachers or companions at school? Was there anyone who taught you, who inspired you particularly?
No, I was good at all subjects. And I did, one time when I was at school, I became fascinated by Egyptology. I mean, I read a good deal. I read classic books on Egypt, and so I tried to teach myself hieroglyphics. I did get a little distance, and I became interested. And I followed up. I know a good deal about the origins of the alphabet, followed through in a different, and from pictorial writing thing. I've always read that. But when I was at school, I read a book by Paul de Croo called Microbe Hunters. And it turned out this has influenced many people I've come across. Paul de Croo was a Dutch science writer, and the book called Microbe Hunters. And in it told the stories of Pasteur and Koch. So I thought, well, maybe I should become a microbiologist. It was a romance, you see. And you know the stories of Pasteur and rabies and Koch and so on. And so I decided I would do medicine. I was 15 years old when I went to university, which wasn't so, because I'd been 2 years ahead, you see. And so was Sidney Brenner.
So yes, I was going to say it's the same.
Well, he grew up on the Rand in Jameson and Johannesburg. And when I met him, I'll tell you about it later. And so there was no medical school in Durban or Pietermaritzburg, the capital. And so I went to Witwatersrand as a medical student. And I found this, and I sailed through my first year, and I went into second year. The first year were the standard pre-medical subjects. It's different from here. Botany,
your parents
zoology.
were well enough off to finance all this, were they?
Well, yes, I stayed. I was a rather young 15. I didn't want me living in residence, so I stayed in the house of my father's brother who'd emigrated to Johannesburg. So I lived with a family there. I didn't go to, I wasn't at one of the boarding houses. And I won a scholarship, so I didn't have any fees. And as for my keep, my father was able to, it was very cheap living, for white South, it was very cheap living, because we had cheap labor and things. And so I went there, and after, in my second year, I started doing anatomy, physiology, and physiological chemistry, as back then it was called then. Those were the standard subjects in the second year. And I found that, I quite found that dissecting anatomy, you dissect the cadavers. There's 6 of you around the table, around the cadaver, with the smell of formalin. I quite enjoyed that. I marveled at the maxilla where the nerves and the blood vessels go through, and how on earth do you do all this? You're articulating it. These vessels, you don't have your blood supply. So it was quite an eye-opener. But in the end I got bored with it, and I found the physiology and the biochemistry much more interesting. And I decided that by this time that I really should learn some chemistry. So I decided to give up medicine, and I went to the dean. I had a good academic record, you see, and I said, I'd like to do another course. And I more or less designed my own curriculum. I didn't know that I was doing it, but there was a very good dean of science called Van der Horst, a zoologist. And he said, well, we'll arrange it. So I did a combination of subjects. It took me a year later, which had never been done before in the university. I had to get a special bill from the Senate or something, I didn't know this was going on, but this is what Van der Horst went on. And so I started doing chemistry, and I decided so I spent half my time in the medical school doing physiology, And I went on with histology, having given up an article. I found histology at the cellular level pretty interesting. So I went on with that, and I did. So I did, and I just decided I must find out something about physics and maths. And I heard a talk about the Schrödinger wave equation, and I thought, well, I have to understand this wave equation. How can matter be particles and waves? And so I started doing physics and maths. So I did a 4-year course instead of a 3-year course, and I passed the exams in physiology, chemistry, physics, and maths, and I got first in everything. I was pretty good at it, and then I decided, what am I going to do next?
Were there, again, asking about teachers, were there any inspiring lecturers?
Yeah,
Or
there was there was a man who gave a talk, a popular talk, on a man called Arthur Blexley, on the wave equation, on Schrödinger's wave equation, and that's what inspired me. And I said, I can't go to my grave not understanding this. I had an intellectual curiosity. That's what it comes down to. I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have described at the time, looking back on it. And I found everything interesting. I always read history and not much of geography. I started reading quite a lot. I started reading, but I'd done that in the school, so I went on reading Roman and Greek history and so on, and it continues to do so. So where I got inspired was in Cape Town. And I went to Cape Town because they were offering a master's degree in physics. I decided I was going to do physics because that was the biggest. So I went and did a master's degree in physics at Cape Town, and for £20 a month, you could, as long as you taught in the practical classes, and that was enough to live on in those days, £20 in Cape Town. So I lived very, very simply in a room in old slave quarters, Malay slave quarters, and I cooked for myself and everything. And my parents wanted to send money, but I sent it back, because I thought I had to be independent. Because they didn't object. You see, being Jewish parents, you might have thought that but they didn't intervene. You know the Jewish joke about my son, the doctor, and all that. You know.
Well, tell me.
Oh, well, they're very proud. The proudest thing a Jewish mother, when her son was the doctor. Later on in the States, when the Jews started going into biochemistry, the joke was made of my son, the biochemist. What's that? So I, at the University of Cape Town.
You were about 20 now, were you? Or?
I was 19. Yes, I went in 46. I turned 20. I turned 20 there. That's right, 15 plus 4, 19. I turned 20 there. And so I did an MSc course. And the professor there was R.W. James. Now he was an inspiration, not so much as as himself, because he wasn't a very inspiring person, but just where he came from. He'd been with Shackleton to the pole, try to get to the pole, yes. Had been marooned on Elephant Island. And he told me the story when he was recruited by Shackleton. Shackleton interviewed him. He was a physicist just out of Cambridge. He and Lawrence Bragg. He was the same class as Lawrence Bragg. And Shackleton, interviewing him, asked him, "Can you sing?" Well, he could sing. The reason was in those the winters when they had to spend time in the hut, they had to entertain themselves. That turned out to be. They called Shackleton the boss. Yes. A great character. So James and stuff was quite interesting. In fact, I did apply to the South African Antarctic Survey but they wouldn't take it because I had glasses on. They would take anybody with glasses. That was also because I was rather restless. And in Cape Town I met my future wife. She was a music student at the University of Cape Town. Then later she went to dance school, to modern dance school. But that was, so Cape Town, I think, University of Cape Town.
What is her name, your wife?
Liebe, L-I-E-B-E. It's the German and the Jewish word for love.
Yes.
Her parents were very romantic. And so she was an only child. And so it was the, so I fell in love, and it was great in Cape Town because it's a beautiful city, a mountain in the backyard, and it was an old city. You see, in Johannesburg and Durban were very new, but Cape Town had, well, there we met artists and so on, people of a wider, just of a wider culture generally. But Johannesburg hardly had anything, and Durban had only the Natal Society for watercolour. It was all very
provincial.
Provincial, right. Although later on in the Durban Art Gallery there was a picture, a painting of T.S. Eliot. I didn't know who he was at the time, but it was by Wyndham Lewis who painted it. It was there. Later on I discovered who he was. But Durban had a good library. When I was at the library, I remember some of the books I read, Ranker's History of the Popes. I read things like that. I knew what Ranker was, so on. I was curious about everything, I think, and I still am curious about almost everything. But I've learned to have to be disciplined and to do things, and so distinguish between hobbies. And although my main hobby is my work, you see. James had been, and then he worked with Bragg, that's Lawrence Bragg.
Yes.
And in 1937 he immigrated to Cape Town. Now in those days, Cape Town, you took a chair in Cape Town as you might go to Toronto or Sydney or Nottingham or Sheffield. Just part of the empire.
Yes.
It's still the empire. And so he was Bragg's second man, but Bragg was still relatively young, and there was another man called Taylor who was roughly contemporary of Bragg. Bragg in 1938 moved to Cambridge after Rutherford died. But so it's possible that when I came to Cambridge, they wanted me to do crystallography, but I started doing crystallography in Cape Town, X-ray crystallography, because that's what James had done. And he had built some X-ray sets for doing X-ray diffraction of crystals, and I did an MSc, which was a good course because the physics and the teaching at Wits, Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, was pretty poor. So I actually attended all James's third-year courses as well as MSc courses. He had and he represented to me, the real modern Cambridge tradition. So I knew, and so I.
It was a 1 or 2 year course.
It was a 2-year course, but I did it in 1 year, and I actually solved the crystal structure of an organic molecule, which wasn't a great feat, but I introduced a new method of doing it. It uses Fourier transforms and so on. And I'd learned mathematics. He didn't know what a Fourier transform was, but in fact he put it into the appendix of his famous book, a standard book he was writing. So and so on the strength of that, he thought, well, you better go to Cambridge. I had toyed with the idea of going to do London because the crystal structure I solved was rather unusual, and I taught myself what's called quantum chemistry. So when I came to Cambridge, this has figures later in the story, I came to Cambridge and I wanted to do something unusual in X-ray crystallography. And I had heard of the unit, the MRC unit, doing hemoglobin and myoglobin. I thought this was the thing I'd like to do, something unusual. But I went to see Bragg when I arrived, and Bragg said the unit was full. Now to this day I don't know if that's true, but I believe it wasn't. The reason is that one of my predecessors from Cape Town was a lady called Virginia Martin, who proved to be very clever but hopeless of research. So I think I may have been. Anyway, Bragg said, I said, well, what shall I do? He said, well, there was some interesting problem in order disorder in silicates. Now, silicates, although I now find them fascinating, I didn't think so at the time. So I looked around, and I wrote, this is all took away, I was there for, the boat took 2 weeks from Cape Town to, so also when there was no airmail, no telephoning. So I, for the first almost 2 months in Cambridge, I didn't have a supervisor.
But you were at Trinity College, is that right?
I went to Trinity, yes.
Yeah.
I had a tutor, William Hamilton, but he wasn't much help. I originally thought I might do a part 2, but he said, you know enough, go straight into, because there's tradition for people from the colonies or the dominions, because the courses were a year or 2, but I'd already done an MS, I knew enough. I mean, so he quite rightly said, do a PhD. So I think the first 2 months in Cambridge I was looking for a supervisor. In the end I went around the Manchester Mafia. There was Leonard Jones, Professor of Chemistry, there was Hartree, Professor of Mathematical Physics. And so in the end Hartree said he would take me on. And I said, what was the problem? He thought it was a problem left over from the war, he said. What was the problem? During the war, he was a mathematical physicist. He'd done important work in atomic physics, but also had introduced new numerical methods of solving problems you couldn't do analytically. And this was the cooling of steel, which seems very... when you make steel, you quench the iron-carbon mixture, that is, and the iron-carbon goes through a series of phase transformations to turn it into hardened steel. So you quench the ingots, and the practice was to leave them for 9 hours overnight, you see. Well, Hartree thought, well, why 9 hours? So he actually began to introduce, this was Baldwin's in Sheffield. Later I went to Sheffield. So he begot Baldwin's to make a few simple experiments. They made some iron bars, cylindrical iron bars, and they had thermocouples to measure the temperature. And he found that the cooling curve, or measuring the cooling as they quenched it, showed that probably the transition was complete in 2 or 3 hours. So they changed the time, and they reduced the time to 3 hours, which increased the output. It made a big difference, and this all the whole steel people did. It was all 19th century practice that continued. The British industry was very much no science in it. German industry was very different, you see. So when I came to Brad Hartree said to me, "Well, I have a problem which might interest you, left over from the war." He told me about this phase transformation in steel. It undergoes a change in structure. The carbon atoms would sit in between the ions, and that's what steel is made of, iron carbide, rearrange themselves. He said, well, I need somebody who knows crystallography. So I said, I'll do it. It turned out in the end that I learned a lot of metallurgy. In Cambridge, I went around and spoke to people. I found a lot about metals, and I worked out a model in which the new phase, as the new phase grew, it had to be initiated, go to nucleation, then it had to grow. And so I got the parameters, and I worked out a model, and I could account for it all. It turned out to be very simple, that what governed it was the dissipation. As the steel cools, it goes through a phase transformation, changes from one phase to another, and gives up heat. And it's the dissipation of the heat. So I modeled all this on a computer. In those days, at the beginning of EDSAC, the Cambridge computer. Originally I did it by hand so I was solving partial differential equations in mathematics. I never thought I'd ever be doing that, but that's what I did. So then I got a bit hell on with the story. So I did my PhD was on phase transformations. but I had a good model. And I never published it. I should have, but I never did. But then I was going to, I didn't know what I was going to do next. But
was he a good supervisor? Interesting.
No, he wasn't very good. He was a train addict. He kept lists of trains and train journeys and so on. He was a distinguished mathematical physicist, but he wasn't inspiring at all. And
were there others who inspired you at that time? I mean, during that
no,
PhD?
No, but I took part. But I had a great time because I went to part 3 lectures in mathematics. I learned group theory, things which later stood me in good stead at a later stage. I won't explain how. And so I went to a lot of the courses. So I just kept educating myself.
And you were married at this time?
I was married, yes. But my wife, we married very young. But my wife went off to live. Well, you see, people didn't live together in those days. You could get married. So we got married just before we came here. And she was a student at the US Ballet, US Lader School, who had been in Cambridge during the war. They were German avant-garde modern dance. And they were, believe it or not, there was Mrs. Roughton. You know about Alice Roughton?
Yes.
Yes, well, she housed them during the war.
Really? This is in Adams Road, is it?
Adams Road, number 9 Adams Road.
That's right.
But it turned out, at the time we got to Cambridge, they had now moved to London. And so that idea, we would both go to Cambridge. I'd be a student in Cavendish and she would be in London. And it didn't work out, so she actually moved to London, and we used to see each other at weekends. She kept us up by teaching in a secondary modern school, so I learned about secondary modern school, teaching on dance various things, because she had university education. So this was...
Did you have anything more to do with Bragg, either now or later?
Nothing more. Bragg wanted me to work on silicates, so a disappointment to him. I think it's quite interesting, order disorder. I wanted to work on my own problem, which was order disorder in alloys, which I'd read about. He said, no, we stopped that work now. It was work that I'd read about. So I didn't go. I don't know, I seem to must have had a lot of, I don't know, I don't think I was arrogant in any way. I just didn't. It's funny, looking back on it, I must have appeared very strange to them, which I've only now begun to think about.
Because you were so self-confident about what you wanted to do, you mean?
I wasn't self-confident. I don't think I boasted or anything like that. I wanted to do things which I liked, which I was interested in, and not just do a thesis for the sake of it. So but I learnt a lot of mathematics. It stood me in good stead. I'll tell you why. So when I developed this model of a growth nucleation, that's separating this, making the first initial change, and then this grows, and I developed this model. This later, it was a preparation of things to come. When I worked on the assembly of tobacco mosaic virus, which is when the virus, there's a model on the stairs which you probably haven't seen. It's the RNA and the protein come together. And when I worked on virus structure, which I later, people were trying to understand how the virus assembled. And they used to mix the protein and the RNA. It was self-assembling. I introduced that word, self-assembling. Protein and RNA only. And they waited for 24 hours under the right salt conditions and the buffer. I managed to do it in 2 to 3 hours, because I realized that there must be, this is such a complicated object, you'd have to go through a phase of starting it. It's a helical assembly. I'll show you the model on the stairs. It's a helical assembly where the units grow in a helix. And the RNA, which is the infectious part of the virus, is inside. So this has to be assembled, and it's not a simple geometrical process. So I realized it has to be started, and I discovered that the protein on its own would make little rings, little discs, and I realized that what must be happening is that the RNA, the long molecule, was making a contact with the RNA, and this would grow. So I started out, and so in 20 minutes he started the assembly, and in 4 hours it was totally complete. And I got that time down to 2 hours. In fact, later on half an hour, when we understood exactly what was happening. So I used the model of nucleation and growth. It was never ever done before. The biochemists called initiation and elongation. And I remember having to explain it to them. They didn't use the word nucleation and growth. It was a physicist's word, biochemist words. As I say, initiation and elongation. And I remember, and I told people, I didn't know that I was going to do physical chemistry of proteins. I went around talking about, worked out the structure of the virus, which I did with Rosalind Franklin. I'll come to in a moment. And none of them would take it up. So I did it myself with students. I did it here. That was the assembly of TMV. And
Tobacco mosaic virus.
yes, that's right. So where are we now?
You're at the end of your PhD and wondering what to do next.
So I spent a year with F.J.W. Rowton, the husband of Alice Rowton, you know, Cambridge, 9 Adams Road.
Yes.
I have a marvelous story about him, because I worked with him, and what I did was solving partial differential equations, which was the mathematics required for the combination of oxygen with hemoglobin. As it enters the cell, the oxygen gets taken up, it's diffusing into the cell, but it's having a chemical reaction. And so you're having a diffusion and chemical reaction at the same time. And it turned out that I could use the mathematics I developed, the computational, the partial differential equations for solving that, and I did it. Rowton was quite impressed, but I realized that this isn't I can't make it. Of course, I can't make a career out of this.
Are you going to tell a story about Rowton? Or?
Oh, about Rowton, yes. So afterwards, I continued doing this, and I went to London, and I went back to crystallography in London, to protein crystallography. But I continued doing things for Rowton, and one day I came up to see Rowton. He lived at the top of the house at 9 Adams Road, right at the top, and he had his lunch sent up on a tray. Down in the garden, you could see from the window, there were various students, Mrs. Rowton, Alice Rowton, Dr. Rowton, and she had the sort of communal meals there. And I knew her son was Jeffrey Rodney, whom I knew. Then Rowton looked out at Alice Rowton down in the garden. They had a cow as well, she had milk.
Yes.
And he said to me, "That's my wife, you know." I wasn't exactly a friend with her. I said, "Yes, I know." He said, "She should have been Dame of Sark." So
my former professor and head of department lived at 8 Adams Road. This is
yes.
Jack Goody.
Oh yes, yes.
So I got to know 8 Adams Road, and he used to tell me stories of his neighbour.
Oh yes, yes.
Alice.
Well, she ran a kind of open house in Wicked pattern, and she just dished out the food and so on. The Rowton lived. So that was.
You went to London.
I went to London. Then I decided I'd better go back. I'd better go back and do some. I'd done crystallography, and I thought I'd been thwarted during the MRC protein, the MRC protein and Bernal. There was an advertisement for a Nuffield Fellowship at Birkbeck College where Bernal was, and Bernal, of course, is the founder of molecular biology. Great man who inspired everybody. He himself never carried anything through. He was always busy. The next problem seemed much more interesting than the one he was working on. He never finished anything. Amazing man, Bernal.
Tell me something more about him. I knew his son very well, Martin.
Which one? Martin.
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 Yes.
Yes. Well, Bernal was the. So I'll tell you what I came to do, though. I came to work on protein crystallography with a man called Harry Carlisle, whom Bernal had recruited from Dorothy Hodgkin. And
how do you spell his name? Harry
Carlisle, C-A-R-L-I-S-A. And he had worked for Dorothy Hodgkin in Oxford. He was trying to solve a protein by some higgledy-piggledy methods that didn't work. And he said, he he made maps of the protein. I said, this is not the way to do it. He said, oh, this is the way. So I worked out the mathematics to explain what he was doing. It was actually nonsense. It was I can't describe it all. And he said to me, what I can see in these maps, I can see alpha helices, as they're called, as parts of the typical motifs in brain structure. So I wrote a program by hand, a computer program, because I was rather adept at that. And I said, there's nothing there. So he got fed up with me. And so I was banished. I had my Nuffield Fellowship, and the Nuffield Fellowship went with an assistant. So he took the assistant, I was banished upstairs, left on my own. And next door, in the room upstairs, was Rosalind Franklin. Unbeknown to me, I'd been there for 4 months already. And see, she never came to tea or coffee. She went across the road to the faculty club. We just had tea in the department. And we were right up in the attic of some old buildings which had been hung during the war. I was in the room next door to her. Now, I said, what do you do? And she showed me her pictures of tobacco-mosaic virus. Those were of virus particles. And they didn't have that quality then. And I was fascinated by it. And I said, can you understand those? She said, yes, we have some idea of radical diffraction. And she was working out now Watson had worked on that problem after the DNA. And so I was able to explain some effects we would see in X-ray photographs. I wrote a paper with her in 1955. And so she introduced me. She changed my life because she introduced me to an important and difficult problem which might take years. So I had something to get my teeth into. And so in the few years I worked with her from 1955 to 58, she died in 58. She had then come from King's College. After she stopped working at the DNA, she took up tobacco-mosaic virus, which Burnell had started in the 30s, 1938, wasn't it, interrupted by the war. So, and Burnell encouraged it. So we worked, and I just joined her. I had my own fellowship, and I just simply joined her. And so we began working together on it. And she died in 1958.
What was she like as a person?
Well, she was brisk, to the point, and not at all the dragon, the person that's painted in Jim Watson's book, The Double Helix.
He describes her as rather plain and never wore.
She wasn't plain.
Never wore makeup and.
No, she was quite smartly written. No, she wore makeup. She wore makeup, but he said she could have made herself prettier. You see, he writes about her. So but she was a sort of rationalist, and I mean, one time we needed some space, and I worked with her, and she said, well, why can't another on the backside would be much more convenient if we swapped labs with him, so we wouldn't have to keep running up and down stairs. It would suit most people. And she said to me, why can't he see?
He being?
This is a member of staff.
Yep.
He worked on silicates, calcite. Remember his name in a moment. Then why can't he be simply rational? I said, well, Rosalind, don't you see? People don't want to move. It's not a question of that we can't find rational solutions to these things. She was, and so she nagged Burnell, but Burnell wouldn't force him to move. And she was, but I had no problems with her. The story was that she couldn't get on with people. I got on with her quite well, because I simply spoke to her as I would, and she treated me as an equal, and she was much older than me, and so on. And because she could see that I had some ability. And then she died in 58, and I found myself in charge of the group of 3 people she had got. At the time she had acquired some postdocs and a student, Ken Holmes, John Finchkin and Holmes, who are both now Fellows of the Royal Society. They moved with me to Cambridge when I moved to Cambridge. And so we managed to get a grant from the United States National Institutes of Health, who didn't give foreign grants, except to work that was not being done in the United States with any people working on virus structure. And after she died in '58, I took up the problem of polio virus structure. She had started it, but she couldn't control the crystals. And I discovered what was wrong with that the crystals were in what's called low salt solution, and the acid in the glass was making them that. So I introduced a new kind of glass and was able to solve polio in 1959. And I showed Bennell the first X-ray picture of polio virus crystals. And he said to me, this picture is worth £10,000. And I hadn't realized, you see, that Bennell had to keep raising money because he had all sorts of adventures going on in his lab. Rosalind Franklin was actually hired to work on coals and carbons, not on plant viruses. But Bennell's idea was that you had to do industrial work. There was work going on. Jeffrey was the man I mentioned who wouldn't move. He was working on on structure of clinker. You know what clinker is?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, well, I didn't know what clinker was in those days. But Bennell thought it might be useful to be able to turn it into something, some kind of cement. And Rosalind worked on graphite. And the money that came in, and there was also work going on flour mill associated. So Bennell was raising money from various sources and financing the pure research on the basis of the applied work that was Bennell. To the RNA, which has of course been opened up to show the RNA inside.
So this is the model you made, is it?
I made for the Brussels exhibition of 1958. It was Rosalind and I were invited to make the model by Lawrence Bragg, who was running this. And we made this one. I also made one of polio, which is a spherical one, but that's in the Science Museum. And so these are the individual units self-assembling, and they accommodate the RNA.
When did you make this?
58.
58.
For an international exhibition in Brussels. Rosalind was dying then. She was in hospital with...
And you made it together?
Well, we started off, but I invented made it in the end. And Rosalind got out of unemployed, constructed a sculptor to blow up these poly. I didn't get on with him because he was a communist, fellow traveller in those days, and I was very much against that. And I do remember when the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, there was a meeting at the University College in Birkbeck by the Fabian Society, and Bennell spoke at that meeting. He had a few people at Birkbeck who were around him. They were sort of fellow travelers who were inspired by the great man. And he said, ever since June, this is 56, this is now October 56, ever since June, we've known that things have been going on in Soviet Russia. And I thought to myself, that June was the Khrushchev speech, 56. I thought, God, I've known this since 1938. I was 11 years old.
You mean the purges and everything?
Yes, purges. And so, but later I got to understand Bennell, and he knew a great deal about the past, but he believed that this would all pass, and just like he didn't use those words. But he looked at things with a long eye of history. Just as the French Revolution was a great upheaval, but it brought a new, well, it settled down, so to speak. A few other revolutions, 1838, 48, and so on. but in the long eye of history. So that's how he viewed things.
Mm.
He believed in progress, you see.
Mm.
That's what he believed in. He believed in, and the book on science and the history of science, which was written in a glowing rationalist form. But I was never friendly with him. He never inspired me, so to speak. But I did observe him, so to speak. But it was Rosalind Franklin who made the difference. So I...
Did she ever talk about, I mean, she was done down, as you mentioned, in the double helix.
Never complained, never.
Never.
She did say, like she says, well, I could have kicked myself for not noticing that my photograph showed there was a twofold axis of symmetry. She didn't know enough crystallography. The whole thing, the whole story is really very strange, because when she was at King's, she had worked out the symmetry of the A form of crystal symmetry, and the crystal symmetry of the A form of DNA. She had sorted out the A and B forms, which was laid the basis for that work. Before that, people had been taking mixed DNA comes in two forms: A form, the B form. The A form, the B form is the one that we always see in flat discs. But the A form is a screwed up form of the B, which you get if you reduce the water, the vapor pressure, reduce the water content. And she had sorted this all out. She was a physical chemist. So she had sorted out the two forms, of A and the B form. And the B form she knew was helical, and I said so. But the A form she thought was some opened out structure. The helix might have come apart. She didn't understand the picture. Now, what she should have realized was that the A form was also double helical, but it wasn't obviously so. And she simply missed it. She said, I could have kicked myself for missing the symmetry. That's the word she said to me. And Watson recognized the relationship between the two forms when he saw the pictures, and they got hold of the report. You know, there's the famous report that was sent to all MRC units, which Crick and Watson seized upon, and they used her data. No question about that. So and to this day I don't know whether she knew how much they knew of her work, but she should have shared the Nobel Prize with them. But then there was Wilkins around. It was not Wilkins. Well, Wilkins, you see in the story about Wilkins was rather kind of shy person, and I don't understand what went on. His line was, we must take our Rosie to dinner and give her a good talking to. You see, it's very childish. I spoke to Rosalind as an equal, and but you see, Wilkins was. But they never would have got on. Very simple. He's clever. He's dead now. He's clever, and he had chosen DNA as a problem, which was beautiful. And but he wasn't. He had no kind of go in him, punch to go ahead. He thought he would. And Rosalind was brought in not by him but by Randall, professor at King's, to put some muscle into the DNA effort, because Wilkins was puttering around with ultraviolet spectroscopy and things like that, and imaging, and Rosalind was a physical chemist. She'd never done crystallography before. So the irony is that Wilkins, Stokes, who was the theoretician at Kingston, Rosalind, all had attended Burnell's courses in Cambridge in the 30s in crystallography. They'd all learnt about space groups, or they should have learnt about space groups, and none of them twigged to it. Only Crick twigged to it when he saw that this had the crystal symmetry of the A forms of the crystalline required that there must be twofold axes of symmetry within the molecule, and that's how he realized there must be a twofold. That's the double helix. And this came out only later when they wrote their paper in 1954. I'll give you a copy of my article on it.
One question about that particular incident. When I've talked to a number of scientists, they mention the name of a King's mathematician, John Griffiths, as important in all this work.
Yes, well, John was quite clever. Man, I know Francis writes about him. He went to a wine tasting.
That's right.
I used to know this all off by heart the night before. John Griffiths thought he paid attention to the fact that Chargaff's rules, or rather law, that the number of A's is equal to the number of T-adenine thymine. But they thought of them as stacking A's and T's. An A required a T in the chain, so he didn't get there. John Griffith had a distinguished father, Griffith, who discovered DNA, but he didn't get. He was a clever man. Francis admired him, but they didn't get it. Not until they knew about Rosalind's work. Oh no, that had no influence upon the structure. Well, I can go on to this. Shall I give you an article on it? Which is 50 years to the day of the papers in Nature.
Yes.
The 3 papers in Nature. This is it. And it's analysis of her. It's an analysis of the pictures and explains. And I used her notebooks, which after she died, I found her notebooks, and I saw how close she had come. But she didn't have anybody, had nobody to talk to. As Wilkins was here, broken.
If you'd been there, Aaron, just a bit earlier.
Oh yes, I would have seen it.
I'll get you to sign this later, if I may.
This shouldn't be capital D's, they put capitals in. And there's also one or two. This is the aftermath. This is Kornberg. I was asked to.
But Hans Kornberg?
No, Arthur Kornberg, who just died, the father of Roger, who worked with me on, I know the way, I always used to know to predict the dyad. A dyad is a twofold axis of symmetry. Twofold axis of symmetry means that you've got, these are 2 identical pens. So if you turn it 380 degrees, it looks exactly the same. Did you get that?
Yeah, I got that.
That's how Perutz used to explain twofold symmetry. And there's the semi-conservative. There you are. And do you want me to just
sign it, please? That would be lovely. Thank you.
Do you want me to say to you?
That would be very nice. Alan Macfarlane. A-L-A-N.
No, I know. And Macfarlane, are you with a small f?
Yes, I am.
And it's the one continuous word.
Yep, that's the one.
With compliments.
That would be
more
very
than
Cambridge.
best wishes.
Yeah, that's lovely. Lovely. Thank you very much indeed.
It's sometimes said that Rosalind didn't get on with Wilkins, and various reasons are given. I think even if he'd been a man, she'd been a man, it would have been the same story. Morris is shrewd, clever, but very, very slow. And any telephone conversation I ever had with Morris, and I had many of those, it would take half an hour to come to the point. Rosalind was quick, decisive, and sometimes could be brusque, but impatient. And so they never would have got on. It's nothing to do with being a man and a woman. And so I think just wanted to get that clear.
Excellent. So after, how long did you work at
Birkbeck? I worked at Birkbeck I worked with her for 4 years, 1954 to 1958. And during those years we worked out the overall structure of tobacco mosaic virus. And also I developed methods, analytical methods for turning the X-ray data of the films into making a map. Because of course the mathematics is rather different from that you use in three-dimensional protein crystals. So I wrote some papers, one of them with Klug, on how you do this. So, and then later, after she died, her students, Finch and Holmes, came with me to Cambridge when we moved here in what year did we move here? 1962, which was the year of the Nobel Prizes. And so we continued the work, and Holmes went off to Germany to be a professor of crystallography at Heidelberg. John Finch stayed with me, and Holmes gradually worked out the three-dimensional structure of the hemoglobin. But we had an outline of the structure as early as 1958, which is the model on the stairs.
So what were you doing? Did you come back to Trinity at that point?
I came back to Peterhouse as a teaching fellow at Peterhouse. John Kendrew was the director of studies. So at Peterhouse, afterwards I succeeded as director of studies, but I taught a great number of subjects because there weren't many teaching fellows. I taught crystallography for 1 year. I taught microwave spectroscopy and chemistry, but I always taught physics. And I taught physics right up to part 2. So it was rather odd. I was theoretically a Nobel Prize in chemistry. I went on in chemistry. I worked in a biological lab and I taught physics. I enjoyed the physics. I was quite a good teacher. And I think I may have told you this. Ken Holmes, when he came to it, found he had been taught by Fred Hoyle and what's the name of the very famous Indian physicist, Louise Johnson's husband, Abdus Salam, and he never learned anything. And I said, how's that? He said, well, you see, they simply would dash off the problem. But you see, when I was a good teacher, because I had to work my way through it, learning it, and I think I was a good teacher.
Did you enjoy teaching?
I enjoyed teaching physics, yes. I had a sort of strange double life. But it stood me in good stead because before I developed three-dimensional image reconstruction, I did various optical things in 2D using optical filtering, optical processing, which I wouldn't have done if I hadn't been teaching optics. So I enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed.
Did you lecture as well, or not?
I gave occasionally I was asked by the university to give a course of lectures, and I gave a number, 6 lectures one time. Because Perutz was the one who gave most of the lectures, but in 1 year he didn't give them, so I gave them. And then later, when I introduced three-dimensional electron microscopy, my method, I was asked to give a few lectures because it always seemed a bit bewildering. So I gave a few lectures in one of the biological departments, not the Cavendish, I've forgotten, it must have been physiology and electron microscopy. So, but I went on teaching at Peterhouse, right? My Nobel Prize was in 1982. And I went on teaching to about 1984. And Hugh Dacre was the master, said to me, you know, if you want to, we can make you a supernumerary fellow, you don't have to teach. So I said, well, I'll become a supernumerary fellow, but I'll still teach for a bit. And I did for a year or two until I got too many other things. I'd started the zinc finger work by then, and so I got too involved with it. And in '86 I became head of the lab, so I was pretty busy. And president of the Royal Society in 1985.
For how long?
5 years.
What was that like?
Well, that was pretty interesting. I had turned it down 5 years before when Michael Atiyah did it. And it turned out I was the only person who refused it since Faraday. But the reason was that I just started a new division at the lab, and I thought being head of the lab was just as prestigious as being president of the Royal Society. Not in the wider world, but in the specialized world that I know. I think it did count for something. And I introduced a Department of Neuroscience here, which we hadn't had before. I did a number of things. So, but president of the Royal Society was, I had to deal with a lot of issues. GMOs, genetically modified organisms, which, by the way, with zinc fingers you can do much better nowadays. In fact, it's producing what the agricultural scientists call a game change in plant agriculture. The zinc fingers are used to modify genes, put genes in. You can put genes in to a specified place, no longer just adding a gene and it comes to, wanders around and gets fixed in the genome in some place where it comes under inappropriate control. And so it's big stuff now. This is what's being done at Sangamo in plant agriculture as well as in therapeutics. So I wandered off. But then I spoke. So I had privatization from Mrs. Thatcher, which I had to oppose because she wanted to sell off all our laboratories. She believed that that in the public sector you were lax, slow, all that sort of thing. Or it isn't like that at all. Only in private industry could you submit to discipline, you see. So it was really an insult to this whole lab, and not only this lab, others like it. And so I had to fight that. I also started on global warming. It was very obvious. And in fact, I did every year in my anniversary address, gave once a year for 5 years, I began to be like the elder Cato. You know, on global warming. I said this, whatever the subject was. I think I said the trouble is I found most of the people didn't know who the elder Cato was, let alone the younger Cato, you know, Cato Utica. So
you'd thunder out dire warnings.
Yeah, well, I didn't thunder out. It's not my style. It wasn't said with huge. I did, but I did start the. One of the things about the human genome, I started the work here with John Sulston. Sidney Brenner and others were going around the world creating Hugo, it was called the Human Genome Organization, and they kept going around having to know about better and better methods. But John Sulston, you know, I inherited from Sidney, simply started out using whatever sequencing capabilities there were, and he made a huge start on it. And I encouraged him. Sidney wanted him to do the products of the genes, that's the proteins produced by the genes, and to sequence those, or to sequence the RNA, which is the intermediate between the DNA and the, so you could work with so you had sequences of all the proteins. I thought that wasn't the right way. Once you're sequencing, and with John Sulston's techniques, he showed you could do about a run of 1 million within a relatively short time, within a few months. So I encouraged him to do the whole genome, because there you get not just the products of the genes, but probably equally important, the regulatory machinery. You see, these are the upstream and downstream sequences, which are attractive factors which switch on the genes and make for specificity. So you get the control of the gene. You really understand the regulation, which is important as mechanism. A lot of the fellow scientists and scientists between a mechanism and a regulation of a mechanism. And so I think I once had to explain to somebody how a governor worked. You know how a governor works in a steam with the balls flying around. The regulation. Well, the word regulation wasn't in anybody's vocabulary. That's how you get, there's a word for it, shifts in
paradigms.
Paradigm shift, yeah. I wouldn't claim to be as great as that, but it was. I emphasize regulation. And now I'm working, ironically, on zinc fingers, which are the most powerful weapon for intervening in gene regulation. I didn't know that at the time. But, So that was the Royal Society for 5 years. I had turned it down, as I said, but I was told, I didn't think they'd ask me again because I was already 69 years old. It was pointed out to me that Ali Todd became president at 69, so there were precedents for it. So I became president at 69. And my wife was very good because she enjoyed the challenge, and because we opened up the place, we had started having lunches, and so Michael Attia, Lily, Michael's wife, I don't know if you ever knew her, wasn't very, she played no part at the Royal Society, but my wife changed a number of things, first of all by making it slightly more social, and also by changing the food at gatherings. There was always canapé. She made sandwiches and things, and proper food, and the meetings. So but it was. I thought that being in London, we had a flat in London, a very good address. I thought we'd go to the theatre and go to the galleries. I was so busy. There was things on almost every night, and so I did that for fun, and it overlapped with my being head of the lab, so I was pretty busy. So we had a driver who drove us into London and took us back again.
Coming back to the lab, you were working in the lab before you became head of the lab for quite a long time.
Oh yes, I came here in '62, and I was in the lab.
Who were you working with? You worked with Crick, or?
No, I worked, well, I had my own group, but I did spend some time working with Crick on chromatin. We published very few things together, but Francis began saying we should tackle our DNA, to work on chromatin, how it's packaged, and he made some fancy models, but none of them were correct. So we had to get evidence for it, and I had a very good postdoc called Roger Kornberg, who got the Nobel Prize last year, who came with me, and we knew there had to be some substructure in chromatin. I knew this from the X-ray diffraction we had of specimens of chromatin, and so he discovered, by doing a very good chemistry on the chemical analysis of chromatin samples, that the histones, which are used for packaging the DNA, on their own form aggregates, and the aggregates, there are 8 histones form an aggregate, and then it's at the end of my Nobel lecture I described this, so it's sort of tumbled. There's a H3H4 form a tetramer, H2A, 2B. These are the names of the histones, form 2 dimers. And so the psychological breakthrough was this, that if the proteins form a globular aggregate like hemoglobin, although a more complicated one, they can't possibly be sitting in the grooves of the DNA, which people had thought. Wilkins had spent years working on DNA. And then he cottoned onto it. And he made the basic step forward that the DNA must be wrapped around the DNA, and that's what he discovered the nucleosome. I didn't put my name on the paper, which I might have done, but because I got him to see that there had to be something repeating on a scale of 100 angstroms, and so he thought it was a linear chain, beads on a string. In fact, it's not beads on a string, it's a string of DNA on beads, beads of protein. I tried to push that forward. I couldn't make any progress with a string on beads. Nobody knew what it was. But still, anyway, so that was the chromatin work. But then I started some other things while I was here. I started tRNA. I also started an Alzheimer group, which is flourishing. And because I felt we ought to be doing something which is of relevance to medical research and medicine. And I hadn't realized that Alzheimer's disease was specific to certain areas of the brain. I thought it was a general degeneration of the brain, but it's not. It starts off in certain parts of the brain called the entorhinal cortex, then it spreads. And so I realized it must be some specific malfunctioning of part of the And so I decided we'd find out what it was. And it had been in the hands of neuro physiologists, and they'd been cutting sections of Alzheimer brains. And I said we must get the material out, like we've done with chromatin. So I introduced chemical separation methods which were used on chromatin, chopping up the material, the enzymes, and fractionating them on columns or else on sucrose gradients. And so we discovered the filaments, which are normal filaments, which are composed of a normal brain protein called tau, which is abnormally assembled but chemically modified. So that was quite a work I feel quite proud of. It's been taken up and I have colleagues here working on it. But by then I'd moved on to zinc fingers later on.
Can we come back to, there were two things. One was, I don't know what his position, whether he was head of the lab, but you must have known Max Baruch's.
Well, Max Baruch was yes, of course I knew him very well. Yes, he was the head of the lab when I came here.
Yes.
And I was a group leader, that was my title. And John Kendrew was the head of one of the divisions in the lab called protein crystallography. But Hugh Huxley, whom you may know of, he'd been a fellow of King's at one time, he was working on the structure of muscle. And muscle, of course, is complex. It's made up of many different proteins, actin, myosin molecules, which interdigitate. I was working on biorhythmic structures, which are complex. They weren't just, Perutz and Kendrew were working on single proteins, myoglobin. So we worked on what we called biological assemblies. And we were using both X-rays and electron microscopy. And Hugh Huxley was the best electron microscopist of his time. And the way he looked at tissues that you cut, you froze them, you cut with a diamond knife or a very sharp glass knife, you cut sections, you built up a three-dimensional picture by a series of sections. Hugh Huxley should have had a Nobel Prize for the sliding filament theory of muscle. It's a great mystery why it never happened. After my Nobel Prize, I was allowed to nominate him year in, year out. It never came about. Speaking to one of the people I got to know in the Nobel committee, said, it was a mistake, it should have happened, but it's too late now. Because there's no, to understand how muscle, a fundamental physiological thing, how does muscle contract? People had thought originally it would be contractile proteins, which like a spring. There's not as families of interdigitating filaments. It's totally unexpected. So there are some injustices in the world, and that's one of them.
What about Max as a as a character?
Well, Max was a very single-minded and determined. He wasn't very learned, but as he went along, he learned all the different things that he had to do, and he wouldn't call him highly imaginative, but he was very determined, and he solved over a period of years the structures of hemoglobin, both in the oxygenated form, when it's fully oxygenated, and the deoxygenated form, and showed, as people had expected, a structural transition between them. The whole molecule changes its structure, and so it's able to, hemoglobin carries 4 molecules of oxygen, and it's, as you go, 1, 2, 3 come in a certain order. When the 4th one goes on, the structure completely changes. It's a conformational it's a tetramer, and it changes the conformation. It's a gross change, and Max gave it a very good title, molecular lung. It's what happens in the lungs, you see, molecular lung. So Max was, I wouldn't call him he wasn't one of these highly imaginative people, but he learned to do the right thing at the right time, and he stuck with it, a very lonely pursuit. It was 22 years of heartbreak, he once described it to me, when things didn't work out. John Kendrew, his colleague, very, very different.
What was he like?
He was, John Kendrew was the marvellous staff officer. I mean, his own, very well organised. He kept records. Max had bits of paper. Absolutely.
You said he threw everything away, Max.
Max threw, yes. He didn't keep things. John Kendrew had a meticulous filing system. I'd never seen one before. He keeps all his records of music. It's a system of cards with holes in them, and you write on them. And then when you want something, you send. It's in a drawer.
Oh, yes.
And you send it. You have some long metal sticks which you put through, and you put them through with the right ones. Then the card comes. All the other cards, your card can be lifted up.
I used to use them.
You used to have that. I don't know what it's called.
No, Cope Chat punch card system. Like
yes,
that.
it was before the computing of punch cards. But so Max was. But you see, Max was a good. Max was. When I told Max how tobacco mosaic virus assembles, I don't know if it's in Minor Bell. Have you got a copy of Minor Bell? When I told Max how TMV assembles, he sort of nodded his head. Here's Minor Bell lecture.
I've got it over.
Have you got it? You haven't got it on you?
Yep, I have.
Oh, virus. And this is, so I told you about nucleation and growth. So that's nucleation. No, it's the wrong model. It doesn't work like that. But you see, it enabled me to do experiments in which we started the assembly, making this protein disc, which you can make under certain conditions. And then you add the RNA, and the whole thing happens in 4 to 20 minutes rather than 24 hours. So because I separate nucleation and then the growth. Now I assumed that growth would occur by further discs going on and then dislocating and adding on. It turned out it doesn't go like that at all. It goes like that, which is the most unlikely process. The disc acts. This is the RNA of the virus folds up into a secondary structure, and there's a loop there, and on the loop you have certain bases which get recognized on the inside, and it gets slurped up, and then you add another disc and there's more slurping. And what Max said to me, you're always telling us the most unlikely stories. Max, as I say, wasn't one of those highly imaginative. Francis saw at once to be right. But the reason I'm telling you this is because before, when I was working on the structure of spherical viruses, which I don't mention here, I had said that the spherical viruses must be built out of hundreds of subunits, and they had to have a certain symmetry. But you can't build more than 60 units on the surface of a sphere, 60 identical units. You see, in TMV, the key thing about TMV is all the units in the helix are identical to each other and also identically organized, identically situated with their neighbors. So that's called, so that's because they have helical symmetry. So when we came to work on spherical viruses, which I gave, Rosalind thought that I ought to have a problem of my own. So I began working on spherical viruses, and these are spherical shaped viruses with the RNA or DNA on the inside. And it soon became clear that many of them had more than several hundred units. And how do you explain that? Because you can't build a structure, you can't build anything more than 60 identical units on the surface of the sphere. Having 60 is the maximum number allowed by mathematical symmetry. And we had known that there had to be several hundred. And so I worked out, I developed together with Caspar, I introduced the term, the idea of quasi-equivalence. In other words, protein molecules in the aggregate don't have to know anything about mathematics. They have to reduce the energy. So if you can build a shell and you can deform the protein slightly, you will build, and you can build something with 160 units. And this was to prove to the doubting Thomases. This is a model of the virus which I showed you in the BBC. And it's built out of, I designed one just to show you could do it. out of little units like this. There's 180 units, and it's so arranged. If you see here that these bonds here aren't in a plane. So if you start putting them together, you get this. So it has built-in curvature. And with this, it's so arranged that the curvature will result in something with 180 units. So this is the complete one. That's a fun. But because you can't put on more than 60 identical units, you have to allow some play. So I put in some play, which an approaching will be taken up. So these things are slightly movable, and the bonds are slightly. You can change the bonds. So as you build it, you have to keep changing it. So this proves you can do it. And but Max. So I didn't know that when I was doing all this work and put forward our theory of quasi-equivalence for virus shells, for spherical viruses. No, it's not equivalent, but quasi-equivalent. Max sort of shook, and I used to explain to Max, used to say, yes, very interesting and so on. And I didn't realize until a few years later he didn't believe it. And I'll tell you how I know this. He, in 1966, he gave an interview in Science magazine to a reporter. And Max spoke about all the successes of the lab, the Nobel Prize in '62 for Crick and Watson, and then himself and Kendrew. And Brenner's work was starting to come out on the messenger RNA. He also says in Klug's work, that's very satisfying. He said it was very far-fetched, you know. Now, when he was directing, he never let on. I used to tell him the stories, he would shake his head as though he was understanding. I didn't believe a word of it. But you see, it was his gift as being a director. He let me get on with it. He didn't try to tell me, persuade me this was nonsense. And Crick understood it immediately. In fact, I know that Crick put me up for a Nobel Prize. He mentioned the spherical viruses. It wasn't mentioned in the theory of they like Buckminster-Fuller geodesic domes. See, but Buckminster-Fuller, and you have to have 5s and 6s. If you notice, there are rings of 5, rings of 6, and you have to have 12 rings of 5. It's like a football. The people hadn't seen footballs in those days with hexagons. You know, football. The Greeks made balls out of goat skins, and they sewed together 12 pentagons and 20 hexagons, and that made football, which was and then they started making football. When I was a boy, the footballs were made of strips, and then the modern footballs are hexagons and pentagons, and but they hadn't existed then. And so Peirce was a very good director because he let people get on with things, and he didn't try to divert me from what he thought was a blind alley.
Can you very quickly, this all overlaps with the work you got the Nobel Prize for, but if you could explain very simply the technique, which you said wasn't crystallography, but it was three-dimensional.
Well, electron microscopy.
Yeah.
Electron microscope is a very powerful way for imaging, and it was invented in the 30s. But in the electron microscope, unlike the light microscope, it can't be focused, so you can't focus down on a level. So when you take an electron micrograph, everything in the line of view is projected into a 2D image. You see that?
Yeah.
So how do you unscramble it? Well, I unscrambled it by, very simply in the end, by taking the specimen and rotating the specimen so you get a series of views from different directions, or else by looking at a random field of particles. I can show you this. A field of particles in which they're lying higgledy-piggledy in all orientations and are trying to relate the different views to each other. And if you can, if you tilt systematically, you know what the angle is between. You know what the angle is. I'm just looking for. I need a chair.
All right.
image reconstruction, we call it, because you combine all the views mathematically, but we're using a computer, I have to explain that, to produce a three-dimensional image, and it's the basis of the X-ray CAT scanner. Some people think I should have got a Nobel Prize for the X-ray CAT scanner, because they copied it. But they didn't. The patent, Hansfield, who got it, when he took out the patent, didn't mention my work at all, but he patented the machine, not the technique. So I felt a bit sore about that in 1979 when they got the Nobel Prize for the X-ray CAT scanner, because he knew my papers, referred to them, and I'd exhibited with him at the Royal Society. Anyway, I'll show you what we used to do. Well, so we had a theory of how you might build these virus shells or the quasi-equivalents, and so this is the structure of these are warts. Human wart is papilloma. Papilloma is rabbit papilloma. Polyoma is another wart-like tumor disease. And if you take electron micrographs, and here you see, we knew roughly. I figured out from just by examining the X-ray, the EM pictures, which look like this. This is a field of pictures. Here's a field. These are virus particles, and this is the surface. Here they're lying in all orientations. So what I did was to introduce tilting experiments. So if you look at particle, here, this one. Where's the threefold? Oh yes, look at this one. So you see here, for example, the different views. This is particle A, and these are models. We're modeling it on a computer. And here we have a whole gallery of views. You see, you're looking right through the object, top and bottom. That's very confusing. But in the old days, I figured it out and showed how. And so we made. This was all the steam age before I introduced three-dimensional image reconstruction. And here you see how we build it. We build the images. Let me just get this. Yes, here we have model building, you see. So here we have one side of the model. Here I'm putting in, do you see the hexagons there? And there's some pentagons. This one has 60 hexagons and 12 pentagons. You always have to have 12 pentagons. And so these are, now this is changing the size of the hexagons and the pentagons. One side of a molecule, you see here they're getting bigger, here they're fusing. And then if you see the top and bottom together, two sides, and there's certain views it looks like that. You see, and so we look at the electron micrograph, and here are the views. Here are selected views, and we can see this group of three. And there it is, simulated. Here. And so all this is sort of steam age stuff. And so this is how we solved the structure of a number of patterns. And later I introduced, and I realized that here we were deducing the structures from a series of different views. So there must be some way, the information is there. Oh, sorry, the information is there. Construction. So here you see a model, it's a 2D example going to 1D. And if you have an object like this, and those are holes in the structure, and you take views in different directions, what you'll see are these. Now if you use Fourier analysis and you make Fourier transforms of these in 2D, these three can all be combined to produce the original object.
Amazing.
It was, yes, and so this is the basis of the X-ray CAT scanner. And so that was the, so you see, and the method of Fourier analysis, you can actually work out, depending upon how much detail you have, the number of views can be determined. So the finer the detail that you want to get in the final reconstruction, you have to take more and more views. And there's a simple mathematical formula which I worked out. And this is what it was. So as you can imagine, when Hounsfield my paper appeared, I think I may have said this already, appeared in January 1982. I mean, sorry, what am I talking about? January, I'm getting all wrong the dates. In January 1968, in August 68, I may have said this already, he took out a patent for building a machine. He got EMI of having 60 detectors, and you put in the object, that is the patient or the X-ray, and you took these views, and then you combined them mathematically, using not Fourier transform, but some rather crude version of it, which the first time it produced nonsense because he didn't have enough views for the sort of detail he was looking, and but then in that was 79, 82, I got the Nobel Prize on my own for chemistry. So that's but Max. So that's the basis of it all. So X-ray would be called computer automated tomography, and I had quite an interesting time trying to get the radiologist to take it up. Have I told you the story already? So when I realized this, I went to see a professor of radiology whom I knew. Well, I knew his right-hand man, and said, look, instead of taking X-ray pictures, you should be able to say, he says, but if you take views in different directions, you'll give the patient a lot of radiation. I said, but look at the detail you'll get out. I didn't at that stage know that you could also see different levels, so you can distinguish the density of a tumor tissue from an ordinary brain tissue. That I wasn't able to show that. But I knew you could make a three-dimensional picture with different degrees of grey levels. That's different degrees of, you know what I mean by grey levels. And so, and one of my colleagues went to the radiologist here, and they said, look, we don't need all this fancy stuff. We know exactly what we're looking at. And I said, but look, how do you find the detail? He said, well, we do computer tomography. What's that? Instead of taking a simple X-ray picture, you have, and if you ever had an X-ray where you lie down, and there's the X-ray source moves along at a certain rate, and underneath your back there's a camera, as a film, and the film moves at a certain rate. So depending upon the relative motion of the X-ray source and the photographic plate, you image, in inverted commas, isn't focused, you get a certain level, at a certain level in the line of view. Everything's in geometrical alignment, and everything else is blurred, and they call that X-ray tomography. And that's what they do. But you see, later I was able to show them that you have an enormous amount of wasted, because you have everything above and below the plane of view is blurred. In fact, you're using much more radiation than you did for the information you get from a three-dimensional image reconstruction. So I introduced that. So I felt a bit peeved when I didn't share the Nobel Prize with Hounsfield and the others. But I was busy with other things, and I think as in 82. But you see, I think I may have said this. The citation for the Nobel Prize called it crystallographic electron microscopy, which isn't at all enough crystals to do with this. But they used it for Fourier analysis, and they didn't understand what Fourier analysis was. So I can do mathematics, but I call this applicable mathematics. The pure mathematics would laugh at what I do. Applicable mathematics.
You then went on. I mean, you've had a whole new set of work. Could you explain this work, which you've alluded to a lot of time, which is zinc finger work?
Well, yes. Well, it's in my introduction. Did I give you this?
Yes.
Yes. This thing tells the story. This is the. I was asked to write a. There it is. Well, it says how I came to do it. I became interested in active chromatin. That's chromatin which has already been, the DNA has already worked itself loose, or it's being worked loose in some way from the chromatin. It's about to be transcribed. That is, the regulatory proteins which are going to switch on the gene can get access to it. And that you can show, this active chromatin, because it's now become susceptible to enzymes, DNA enzymes, which will attack the DNA. So you found, if you looked at chromatin, which you extracted from living cells, you'd find that some of the chromatin was accessible to enzymes, and those correlated with, once you knew what they were, these would be genes which were going to be activated. So I began looking for a source of active chromatin, and now and I wanted to investigate that. It's described in the introduction here. So I read a lot of literature. Now, if I was going to do structural work, that's X-ray crystallography, biochemistry, and possibly electron microscopy or things of that sort. If you're going to do that, you need large quantities. So I looked for something which you get milligram quantities out. So you can do a lot of biochemistry using microgram quantities. This is because the proteins are run on polyacrylamide gels. We only have very trace of proteins, and these show up in what's called gels, electrophoresis. So I wanted something that you could get quantities on to crystallize or to investigate by serious biochemistry. And so I found that there was reading literature, there was a gene of in Xenopus, the South African frog or toad, which was present in large amounts. I was alerted to it by reading various papers, and one of my colleagues, Hugh Pelham, had actually worked on it with my current colleagues, and he showed me some, and I see if we get large quantities from it, so I decided to work on the 5S RNA genes of Xenopus. These make 5S RNA, which is the product of the gene. In this case, the 5S RNA gets incorporated into ribosomes, which are protein synthesis factories. That's by the way. And so I decided to try to get to work on it. And I had a new postdoc, a young man called Miller. I put him to work on it, and I discovered, or uncovered, by a series of purely biochemical experiments over a period of several years, that this had a repeating structure. There was a repeating structure in the. There was a repeating structure in the, and this was the repeating structure, and it had 9 units. And this is the DNA, and these 9 units bound to the DNA. And so what we knew at the time is that they had certain cysteines and histidine residues, C's and H's here. So I interpreted it as folding up into little units, and each unit bound a certain number of bases. And when the sequence came out, the protein sequence, the amino acid sequence came out of the zinc fingers, here you are, 9 of these repeating units, and these are the 1-letter code for amino acids. And you see they have 2 cysteines and 2 histidines in each of the units. And these are the ligands. These are the commonest amino acid which bind zinc. And we measured the amount of zinc, and there was between 7 and 11, and there are 9 of these. So it was all done biochemically. Later on, people thought it was all done by bioinformatics. It's a load of coswallop. It was all done by chemistry, but people couldn't grasp it. Still people are writing it was all done by bioinformatics. So it went on from strength to strength, and this is the most common. It's the most common motif. And here you are. The total number of genes. 3% of the human genome consists of cysteine, 2 histidine, 2 types of zinc fingers. There's another type of zinc finger called C4, which I won't go into now. And you see, as you go up in the evolutionary scale, you get more and more of these. So down in the C. elegans and the worm, and the zebrafish you get 1.7%, and the human you get 3%. So you see they're a marvelous modular system. It's a combinatorial system. You can combine the fingers. Each finger has a different amino acid sequence which can recognize the sequence of DNA. And so this became a tool for, so it became the ideal tool for making artificial synthetic fingers for having access to genes. This has become a big technology. Did I send you any of the press releases?
You sent me one, yes.
Yeah, well, that was the. So now it's in patience, and so it's a really major. Well, it's a major piece of work, and it's taken some years to. I started out doing it myself, but we formed my colleague Yan Chu, who was half Chinese and half Greek. Very entrepreneurial. He left the lab. He could have stayed on here to form a company called GenDAC. Have I mentioned this before? GenDAC. Gen for gene, DAC for dactyl, Greek finger. And he founded the company and got some backing from it. And because the MRC, we took out patents, I should say, because we took out patents, and the MRC held the patents. And in the lab, we started making libraries of zinc fingers. We began to work out the rules of recognition. And this GenDAC was bought out by an astute American who created a business. Yan Chu created a research establishment, very high class, very high powered, but no money, because people didn't invest in it. There were a few backers from an MRC seed fund, and so Sangamo, which means Sango doesn't mean anything. It's named after Sangamon County in Illinois. His grandfather had a business there, and and so I go to the States 2 or 3 times a year, and they now going great, as they would say. They might even make some money. It's now it's become the method of choice of. It's also now in plant agriculture, and it's going to make the old-fashioned GMOs look like steam engines compared with the internal combustion engine. And it's being developed by Dow Agricultural Sciences and the American company, and they say this is game-changing technology. That's high praise indeed.
Paradigm shift, indeed.
Paradigm shift, yeah, game-changing. Yeah,
Excellent. Well, congratulations on that. And
well, I haven't. Yes, so I know I've been nominated for another Nobel Prize for it.
Well, I've heard that too. So
it may be. Well, it depends.
It'd be wonderful if I had the 2 living Nobel Prize winners in the world. I've interviewed Fred Sanger, and if you get a second one.
Well, I wouldn't bet on it. I've got to live long enough. They're hard-headed, you see. And how do you know that if you make a cure, it won't revert? So I hope I live long enough to see it.
It sounds as if you will.
Yes, so that's how I came to do it. But I was purely following. I didn't start out. I think, as I've said so in my Nobel addresses, I didn't take up science in order to be a benefactor of mankind. It's curiosity. And that's what the driving force is, curiosity. And it's not only thinking, you see. I know that you're thinkers, but it's also doing. And I put a lot of work into doing it, you see. You can't.
When you say doing, do you mean making things, or?
Yes, we used to make them in the lab. We used to make fingers in the lab, chemically. And then so I had to learn how to synthesize these things. And I know enough chemistry. Well, you know, my PhD is in physics.
Yes.
But over the years I've learned enough chemistry, and I don't do it with my own hands, but I know what to do. I understand the chemistry. And so that's what I mean by doing. And it was only because of that Sangamo. Well, what happened in 1994? I discovered the zinc fingers in the first paper was 1980. When was the first paper? 985. That was then. It said it was a. I should give you an original, but I haven't got any left. It was a DNA binding repeating unit in the gene of something or other. You see, of the xenopus gene, and so repeating, and so the and that showed, and it does say in the end that this is a very beautiful combinatorial scheme. It's unlikely to be confined just to this. I didn't write this, but I used to say to a lowly gene in a lowly animal. But you see, the whole thing is that this happens to be what we're working on. People could have discovered it in somewhere else. And so well, you know what Pasteur said, chance favors, I used to think chance favors the prepared mind. No, but somebody told me it's the wrong quotation. Chance favors only the prepared mind. And I haven't checked that that's the true, but it's more true that it's only, you know, because you have to be thinking about something in order to, what are you prepared for, you see?
Yes.
So
and you said it wasn't, when we were walking down the stairs, you mentioned it wasn't just intelligence, very cleverness, but some imaginative.
Yes, some imaginative powers, yes. And I think I think I do have an imagination. It's people say three-dimensional imagination. No, imagination is what if? What if? What if? It's that kind of imagination. And you also have to have some technological capacity in order to do it, you see. Otherwise you can't sort of say, you can't just write like the great man Pauling when he was going to solve crystal structures. You know, the great Linus Pauling.
Yeah.
He would write in Caltech, and they tried to solve proteins. He would write, his eye occurs a lot, I have decided this is the way to do it. He would send this out to the man at Caltech. No, and he never said, he proposed things which were unrealizable, you see. He didn't understand enough of the detail. See, the truth's in the detail. That's a quotation from Lucien van Leeuwen. You ever read it by Stendhal? It's quite one of his lesser-known works. There's a marvelous sentence which I've got in French somewhere, but what it says is, "Tell me," he said to his uncle, "tell me it all, but tell me it's in detail. There's no truth but in anything but the details." I'll find the French quotation. I looked it up in Stendhal later. I read it in English. Lucien van Leeuwen. One of his lesson.